The complete timeline of Middle-earth, LOTR lore. Before the first star was lit, before the first wave broke on any shore, before there was a shore at all, there was a song, not a metaphor, not a poetic framing device, a song. Tolkien means this literally, and if you have spent any time with the Ainu Lindal, you know that the entire history of Middle-earth, every king and every war and every ring ever forged, every city raised in glory and pulled down in fire, every hobbit who ever smoked a pipe in a comfortable chair at the end of a long road, all of it begins not with a date, but with a note of music sounded in the mind of a god before time existed. That is the foundation. That is the actual ground floor of this timeline. And here is the thing that changes everything once you really hear it. Melkor's discord enters the music before the world is made. Evil is not an intrusion into Middle-earth's history. It is woven into the first chord. The timeline of this world does not begin in innocence and fall. It begins already compromised, already containing within its very structure the shadow that will chase every age to its end. This is not speculation. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down. So when people talk about the complete timeline of Middle-earth, when they think about ages and dates and the rise and fall of kingdoms, they are usually thinking about something that begins around the forging of the rings, or maybe at the earliest with the First Age and the wars of the elves against Morgoth. But by Tolkien's own internal chronology, by the time Celebrimbor lights the first forge in Eregion, by the time Sauron whispers his first lie to an eager craftsman, more than 37,000 years of documented history have already elapsed. Continents have been destroyed. Two enormous trees, whose light was unlike any light the sun has ever produced, have been murdered. An entire civilization built on a paradise island has been swallowed by the ocean in a single day, and the shape of the world itself has been rewritten by an act of divine will. By the time Bilbo Baggins finds a small golden ring in the dark, the world is already ancient beyond reckoning, already living in the long shadow of what it used to be. That is what this script is about. Not just the dates, not just the events in their sequence, but what those events mean when you lay them side by side and ask the question that Tolkien spent his entire life circling. If every age ends in ruin, if the pattern repeats across tens of thousands of years without exception, was the defeat of Sauron at the end of the Third Age a true ending, or just the longest pause before a darkness that Tolkien never lived to name? We are going to walk the full length of this timeline. We are going to go to the places the movies never reached and the casual reader rarely follows. And by the end, the world you thought you knew is going to feel different, older, heavier, and somehow, impossibly, more worth loving for it. Let us begin before the beginning. The Ainu Lindala opens with Ilúvatar alone. Tolkien writes that he made the Ainur, the Holy Ones, from his thought, and that they existed before anything else was made, before time, before space, before any of the concepts we use to understand existence had a referent. The Ainur are not angels in the way popular culture understands angels, winged servants running errands between worlds. They are more like thoughts that became persons. They are the first and deepest expression of Ilúvatar's creative nature, and their nature is music. Ilúvatar teaches them themes, and they play them, and the music they make together is the first act of subcreation in the history of existence. But here is the part that matters. Melkor, the greatest of the Ainur, the one with the most power and the widest range of gifts, begins weaving his own themes into the music, themes of his own devising, and those themes introduce discord. Tolkien describes what happens next in language that is almost physically uncomfortable to read. He says that from Melkor's discord arose a sound like the wailing of many strings, and that it drowned out the beauty of the original theme, and that some of the Ainur ceased to sing and wept. But here is where the cosmology does something almost unbearable in its depth. Ilúvatar does not simply silence Melkor. He incorporates the discord. He weaves it into a third theme, one that is so vast and so sorrowful that those who heard it afterward said it was the most beautiful thing in the music. The theme that mourned the wounding of the original song and yet transformed that wound into something new. Tolkien is doing something very specific here. He is saying that the history of this world, its entire timeline from the first moment to the last, is the playing out of a song that already contains both the beauty and the corruption. The grief is not accidental. The grief is structural. It was always going to be there because it was written into the very act of creation. Now think about what that actually means for everything that follows. Every king who rises and falls, every city built in defiance of the dark that is eventually consumed by it, every friendship forged in fire that time or treachery eventually destroys. None of this is Tolkien failing to imagine a happy world. This is Tolkien being ruthlessly consistent with his own cosmological premise. The world is sung into existence already carrying its wound, and the entire timeline, all 37,000 years of documented history, is the story of what that wound produces. Pay attention to this next part, because it changes how you hear everything else in this script. When the Ainulindale ends, and the Ainur look into the void and see the world that Ilúvatar will create, some of them are so moved by the vision that they choose to enter into it, to become part of it, to leave the eternal and timeless realm where they have existed and bind themselves to the material world, to its weather and its seasons and its history, to suffer alongside the children of Ilúvatar, which is to say, alongside us. These are the Valar and the Maiar, and the greatest of them, Manwë and Varda and Ulmo and Yavanna, give up something real to do this. They give up their perspective. They give up the view from above the music. They enter the song and can no longer hear the whole of it. This is never stated outright in quite those terms, but it follows directly from what Tolkien writes in letter 131, where he describes the mythological plane as operating at a different level from the historical narrative. The Valar who enter Arda know what was in the music, but they are now inside time, subject to its forward motion, unable to see what comes next. And Melkor enters Arda with them, which means the discord is inside time too. This is the starting line. Not a date, a condition. Now, the years of the lamps. Picture this. Arda has just been shaped from the chaos of the first creation. The Valar are moving through a young world, raising mountains, carving riverbeds, filling oceans. The world is symmetrical in a way it will never be again. Two enormous lamps standing at the north and south poles of the world, pouring light over everything, and in that light the first forests grow in the middle of the world, vast and extraordinary, unlike anything that will ever exist again. The Valar build their holes on the island of Almarin in the middle of the inland sea, and for a time that Tolkien calls the Spring of Arda, the world is genuinely new, genuinely unmarked. You have to imagine a planet that has never been wounded, where the music of the Ainur is still close to the surface of things, audible in the way that fire crackles or water moves. The trees in those first forests are not like the trees of the Third Age. They are older than the elves, older than any memory that will survive, and their roots go down into rock that has never been disturbed. Melkor is in Utumno, hidden under the northern mountains, already building, already corrupting, already breeding, in the dark, the first twisted forms of what will eventually become orcs. But that darkness has not yet touched the world south of his fortresses. And so for a moment, a long moment, perhaps tens of thousands of years by the reckoning of the sun that does not yet exist, the world is simply alive in a way that it will never quite manage again. Then Melkor strikes. He destroys the lamps. He throws down the pillars. The great inland sea is drained. Almarin is drowned. The symmetry of the young world is shattered in a single catastrophic act, and the forests of the spring are gone, not burned, not merely damaged, but gone, replaced by the tilted and wounded geography we will eventually recognize as Middle-earth. The northern and southern reaches of the world are thrust into darkness. The shape of the continents is permanently altered. This is the first ruin, the first time the darkness wins. And we are still in a time so early that no elf has ever opened their eyes. The Valar retreat to the west, to the land that will become Valinor, and they raise the Pelori, the mountain walls, to protect their new home. And here is something worth pausing on. This is the first act of walled isolation in the history of Arda. The Valar do not scatter through the world and fight Melkor on every shore. They consolidate, they protect themselves, and they leave Middle-earth in the dark. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it becomes a pattern. The years of the trees follow. Yavanna and Nienna, the Vala of grief, work together. Yavanna sings, and Nienna weeps, and from the mingling of song and sorrow, the two trees of Valinor are born. Telperion, the silver tree, and Laurelin, the golden tree. They do not give off light the way the lamps did, indiscriminate and everywhere. They pulse. Telperion waxes and Laurelin wanes, and then Telperion wanes and Laurelin waxes, and each is at its brightest for 1 hour and then fades. And the overlap of their light, the hour when both silver and gold mix in the air of Valinor, is called the mingling of the lights, and Tolkien describes it with the kind of care that suggests he is describing something he genuinely mourned. But Middle-earth is dark, starlit, eventually, when Varda kindles the stars in response to the coming of the elves, but dark in the sense that the great light does not reach it. The Valar are in Valinor with their trees, and Middle-earth is under stars and under the growing shadow of Utumno, and it is in this world, this starlit, not quite dark world, that the elves awaken. Here is where the timeline does something extraordinary. The years of the trees are counted in Valian years. Each Valian year is approximately 9.5 of our solar years, and the years of the trees run for approximately 1495 Valian years before the two trees are destroyed. Do the arithmetic. That is over 14,000 solar years in the light of the trees, and before the trees, the years of the lamps, and before the lamps, the years of darkness when Melkor first fortified the north. We are talking about an enormous span of time before the sun rises for the first time. And the elves are awake for a substantial portion of the years of the trees. They wake in the far east of Middle-earth, at Cuiviénen, the waters of awakening, under stars, not knowing the Valar, not knowing Valinor, not knowing anything except the world around them and each other. Tolkien writes in the Quenta Silmarillion that the elves in this period develop language and song and begin to understand the world, and that Melkor, who is no fool, sends shadows and shape-shifting spirits to hunt them in the dark and carry some of them away. These captured elves are what Tolkien suggests, carefully, with appropriate uncertainty, may have been the origin of the orcs. The darkening of the firstborn, the mirror image, the ruin of the most beautiful beings in Arda. This is early in the timeline, so early that most readers never reach it, and it is already this dark, already this consequential. The great journey follows. The Valar wage war on Melkor, overthrow Utumno, and invite the elves to come to Valinor. Most elves make the journey west, the enormous march across a continent, across the Blue Mountains, to the shores of the sea, where Ulmo's floating island ferries them in groups to Aman. These are the Eldar. But not all elves go. Some turn back, some never begin, some are lost along the way. And this first sundering of the elvish people, this first moment where a people divides between light and shadow, between the journey and the refusal of the journey, sets a pattern that the entire timeline will repeat in different keys across every subsequent age. The Noldor go to Valinor and become perhaps the most extraordinarily skilled craftsmen in the history of Arda. Feanor is born, and if you know what Feanor is, if you understand what his existence means, then you understand that the entire First Age is in some sense the long catastrophic consequence of one man's genius and one man's pride. But before we get to Feanor, before we get to the Silmarils and the Oath and the kinslaying, there is something that almost never gets discussed in chronological overviews of this timeline. Something that happens in Valinor, quietly, in the deep time of the years of the trees, that will shape everything that follows. Tolkien writes in the Quenta Silmarillion that Feanor created the Tengwar script, the system of letters that becomes the basis of written language in Arda. He writes that Feanor also captured the light of the two trees in 3 gemstones of his own making, and that these stones, the Silmarils, were so beautiful that Varda hallowed them. The Holy Queen of the Stars blessed an object made by a mortal, or mortal-adjacent, being. That does not happen again in the history of the world, not in the same way. And yet what is Feanor going to do with this unprecedented creative achievement? He is going to swear an oath so terrible that it haunts every generation of his descendants for the entire First Age, and arguably beyond. Pay attention to this next part. When Morgoth, which is what Melkor becomes after the destruction of the trees, steals the Silmarils and kills Feanor's father, Feanor stands up in the great square of Tirion in Valinor and makes his oath. He and his 7 sons swear by Ilúvatar, by Manwë, by Varda, by the everlasting dark itself, that they will pursue any who holds a Silmaril, friend or foe, elf or man or Vala, and bring them to ruin. The exact wording in the Quenta Silmarillion is stunning in its totality. They invoke the void, they invoke their own souls. They swear an oath with no escape clause, no term limit, no provision for mercy. And here is the pivot that changes how the entire First Age reads. The oath is not just a dramatic moment, it is a machine. Once sworn, it operates independently of the intentions of the people who swore it. It forces decisions, it poisons alliances. It turns potential salvation into disaster, at multiple points across hundreds of years of First Age history. The sons of Feanor will repeatedly face moments where they could make the compassionate choice, where they could join forces with those fighting Morgoth, where the arc of the war might bend toward victory, and the oath will not let them. The oath looks like a story decision. It is actually a theological statement about the nature of binding promises in a world where the spoken word carries genuine ontological weight. Because here is what that actually means for the timeline. Tolkien's world operates on the principle that oaths and words are real in a way they are not in ordinary life. When Feanor speaks the oath, it does not just express his intention, it creates an obligation that the universe itself will enforce. The Valar warn him not to swear it. He swears it anyway. And the First Age, which runs from this moment to the War of Wrath at its end, approximately 6 centuries of the sun after the Noldor return to Middle-earth, is the story of what happens when the greatest craftsman who ever lived sacrifices the future to his grief. This is already a pattern in the timeline. Creation followed by corruption, glory followed by ruin. Not because Tolkien was pessimistic, because he was precise. Picture this. The host of the Noldor has reached the shores of Middle-earth after crossing the Helcaraxë, the grinding ice of the far north, on foot. Not all of them. Feanor's people crossed the sea in the ships of the Teleri, ships that were not given, but taken, at the cost of elf blood spilled by elf swords in the harbor of Alqualonde, the first kinslaying, the first murder of kindred by kindred in the world. The other Noldor crossed the ice at enormous cost in lives and suffering, led by Fingolfin, Feanor's half-brother, who watched the ships burn on the shores of Middle-earth when Feanor's people arrived and had no intention of letting anyone follow them. Feanor burned the boats and left his kin to the ice. These people have crossed a continent of frozen death. They have arrived in a world already under the shadow of Morgoth, and they have arrived just in time to see the sky change. Because as the Noldor set foot on the shores of Middle-earth, the sun rises for the first time. Tolkien arranges this with the deliberateness of a composer. The return of the elves and the birth of the sun are simultaneous. It is a new world. The years of the trees are over. The trees are dead, and what they contained has been transformed into something new and imperfect, and still beautiful. The first age of the sun begins. And within it, in the 6 centuries before Morgoth is finally overthrown, you have what Tolkien called in letter 131, the 3 great tales of the elder days, the tale of Beren and Luthien, the tale of the children of Húrin, and the tale of the fall of Gondolin. These 3 stories are not just the dramatic highlights of the First Age. They are structural pillars. Each one is a complete engagement with the question of what it costs to be mortal, or immortal, in a world where the most powerful being you can imagine is actively working to destroy everything good. The tale of Beren and Luthien is the love story at the center of the mythology. A mortal man and an immortal elf woman quest to recover a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth himself. They succeed, against every conceivable probability, through something that the text suggests is not luck and not power, but something closer to grace, to a quality of love so genuine that the cosmological rules of the world bend slightly to accommodate it. Luthien is the daughter of Thingol, king of Doriath, and Melian, a Maya, an angelic being of the same order as the wizards who will appear in the Third Age. She is the most powerful being ever born of the union of Elf and Ainur, and she chooses mortality for love. This is the first time in the history of Middle-earth that an immortal being chooses to die. Not is killed, chooses. Luthien, given the choice between returning to Valinor and sailing west, chooses instead to be with Beren, to accept the gift of men, to leave the world when her time comes. Tolkien makes clear in his letters that this tale was not merely mythology to him. Luthien is modeled on his wife Edith, and the grief of Beren at her death and the grace of her return are the most personal thing in the legendarium. When Tolkien died, he had Luthien carved on Edith's gravestone. This is the heart of the First Age, not the battles, not the political maneuvering. This. But the tale of the children of Húrin is something else entirely. It is the darkest thing in the timeline, and one of the darkest things in any literature that calls itself fantasy. Húrin is a man who defies Morgoth directly, to his face, and Morgoth, who does not forgive, puts a curse on his entire line. Then he forces Húrin to watch, from a chair on a mountaintop, unable to look away, as the curse destroys his son, his daughter, and everything they touch across a generation. Turin Turambar, Húrin's son, is perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire legendarium. He is brave, he is brilliant, he is genuinely heroic in every conventional sense, and he is doomed, not in a vague narrative sense. Doom, in Tolkien's usage, has ontological weight. It is the working out of a curse that was sworn by the most powerful evil being in creation. And what Turin demonstrates across the length of his story is that a person can be wholly good in intention and wholly ruined by forces beyond their choice or control. He kills his best friend by accident. He marries his sister without knowing who she is. When the truth is finally revealed, both of them choose death. This is not a warning about pride, though pride is part of it. This is Tolkien meditating on what evil actually does when it has centuries and cosmic-level power to work with. Evil does not beat Turin in fair combat. Evil arranges the circumstances of his life so that his own virtues become weapons against him. His loyalty, his courage, his refusal to submit, all of it is used against him. By the end, the sword Gurthang, the black blade he has carried across the length of his story, speaks. In the oldest surviving version of the tale, it actually speaks, and it consents to kill its master because it understands that this is mercy. That is the First Age in miniature. Genuine beauty, genuinely crushed, not by weakness, but by the specific weight of a darkness that has had thousands of years to learn exactly how to break good things. And then there is Gondolin. The Fall of Gondolin. You get perhaps 3 lines of it in Appendix B. You get more in the Quenta Silmarillion, but the full account, The one that Tolkien began writing in 1916 in a hospital tent, recovering from the Battle of the Somme, is in Unfinished Tales, and in the posthumous collection Christopher Tolkien assembled. And it is extraordinary. Gondolin is the hidden city, the secret refuge, built in a mountain-ringed valley by Turgon, Fingolfin's son, where survivors of the great defeats of the First Age have gathered to build something beautiful and hoped for. The city takes 200 years to build. 200 years. It is described as the fairest city ever raised by elves in Middle-earth, and Tolkien, in Letter 131, gives it an importance that the brief summaries in Appendix B cannot convey. Morgoth eventually finds it, not through battle, through betrayal. One of Gondolin's own people, Maeglin, gives the city up for a promise he will not receive. The armies of Morgoth come through the mountains at night, Balrogs and dragons and uncountable orcs, and Gondolin burns. The people who escape do so through a secret pass, carrying children on their backs, fighting rearguard actions against horrors that should be impossible to survive. Glorfindel, one of the great lords of Gondolin, buys the passage of the fleeing people by fighting a Balrog alone on a mountain peak. He kills the Balrog. He also dies. The courage required for that act is not the courage of someone who expects to survive. It is the courage of someone who knows they will not and does not turn back anyway. From among the survivors of Gondolin comes Eärendil, and Eärendil, sailing a ship made in part from the last remnants of the trees, the Morning Star, eventually carries one of the Silmarils to Valinor and begs the Valar to come back to Middle-earth and finally end the war with Morgoth. They come. The War of Wrath breaks the geography of the world. Beleriand, the land where all these stories happened, the shores where the Noldor first landed, the fields where Beren and Luthien walked, the valley where Gondolin stood, all of it sinks beneath the sea. The First Age ends in total geographic annihilation. Every place that mattered is gone. But here is the critical thing. Here is the line that connects the First Age to everything that follows. Morgoth is defeated. He is expelled from the world entirely, thrust through the door of night into the void beyond the walls of the world. But the Silmarils, the three greatest objects ever made, are not recovered in any way that constitutes a victory. One is taken by a son of Feanor, and he cannot bear to hold it because of the oath, and he casts it into the earth, into a chasm of fire. One is taken by another son of Feanor, and he cannot bear it either, and he throws himself into the sea. The third, the one Eärendil carries on his ship, becomes a star. The things that were made to contain the light of the trees, the light that could have restored something, the light that was stolen and fought over for 6 centuries at the cost of uncountable lives, end up in a chasm, in the sea, and in the sky, unreachable, gone. The light that the trees contained is not restored to the world. It is simply moved out of reach. The pattern holds. The victory costs everything and restores nothing that was lost. This is where the Second Age begins. And between the end of the First Age and the beginning of the Second Age, Tolkien gives us a gift that most readers miss entirely. He gives us Eonwë's offer, the herald of the Valar, commanding the armies of the West in the War of Wrath, offers the surviving Noldor a pardon. After everything, after the kinslaying, after the burning of the ships, after centuries of pride and blood and broken oaths, the Valar offer them the chance to come home. Most of the surviving Noldor take it, but not all, and specifically, not Galadriel. The Unfinished Tales give us the complicated history of Galadriel's refusal of the pardon, and the different versions of the tale, as Christopher Tolkien documents, do not entirely agree with each other. But the core is consistent. Galadriel, the greatest of the Noldor remaining in Middle-earth, was part of the host that left Valinor. She was present for, if not directly responsible for, the events that led to the kinslaying, and she stays in Middle-earth. Tolkien suggests in one version that she refused on principle, that she would not accept a pardon she felt she had not earned through her own choice. In another, she refuses because she still desires to rule her own realm, because the ambition that drove so many of the Noldor into exile is still part of her, unresolved. Think about what that means. Galadriel, who in the Third Age will be one of the wisest and most temperate beings in Middle-earth, one who refuses the One Ring, one who counsels patience and mercy, begins the Second Age as someone who will not accept forgiveness because she still wants power. She is not yet who she will become. The Galadriel of Lothlorien is the product of the entire Second Age plus the Third. She is not born wise. She earns it across an almost incomprehensible span of time. The Second Age of the Sun runs for approximately 3,441 years. In human terms, 3,500 years. In Elvish terms, a long chapter. The great fact of the Second Age is Numenor. And Numenor is so important to the timeline, so central to the question of what the ages of Middle-earth are building toward, that it deserves the full treatment it rarely gets in popular discussions of the lore. After the War of Wrath, Ilúvatar and the Valar look at the men who had fought on the side of the West, the Edain, the people whose ancestors had crossed the Blue Mountains and entered Beleriand in the middle of the First Age and allied with the Elves against Morgoth. These men did not have to do this. They were free people, they chose the harder thing, and as a reward, the Valar raise a new island from the sea, in the middle of the great ocean between Middle-earth and Valinor, equidistant from both, and the Edain are given this island as their home. They name it Numenor, the land of the West. The Númenóreans are the men of the Second Age, as the Elves were the people of the First. They receive gifts of wisdom and craft, and long life, far longer than ordinary men, as an expression of their kinship with the Elves, through generations of intermarriage and alliance. The kings of Númenor in the early Second Age live for hundreds of years. They become the greatest mariners in history, trading across the entirety of the known world, making contact with the elves of Middle-earth, building cities on the coasts, learning craft and lore and language. And one rule, one prohibition: they are not to sail so far west that Valinor comes into sight. They are not to try to reach the Undying Lands, because they are mortal, and the Undying Lands are not made for mortal life. They can sail every other direction. The world is theirs in every other direction, but not west. Not that far west. The Valar are not being arbitrary. The prohibition is cosmological. Mortality is not a curse. In the mythology, it is the gift of men, the freedom to leave the circles of the world and go somewhere beyond, somewhere that not even the Valar know. But the Númenóreans do not experience it as a gift. They experience it as a deprivation. They live for 500 years, and then they die, and the elves who visit their shores do not die at all, and the Númenóreans look west toward a horizon they cannot cross, and feel cheated. This resentment builds across the Second Age. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then faster, as each generation of kings inherits the resentment along with the throne. The shadow, Tolkien calls it, the shadow that falls over Númenor, the growing bitterness, the darkening of what was once a gracious and generous people. And into this darkening world steps Sauron. Now, Sauron's arc in the timeline of the Second Age is something that deserves the careful attention it almost never gets, because Sauron in the Second Age is not the Dark Lord of the Third Age films, not the all-seeing eye atop Barad-dûr, not the remote and terrible power directing armies from a distance. Sauron in the early Second Age is mobile, cunning, and in at least one documented instance, genuinely persuasive in a way that suggests intelligence rather than mere menace. The Rings of Power section of Unfinished Tales, drawing on the materials that became of the Rings of Power and the Third Age in the Silmarillion, gives us the sequence. Sauron comes to the elvish craftsmen of Eregion, specifically to Celebrimbor, Feanor's grandson, in a fair form, calling himself Annatar, Lord of Gifts. He claims to be an emissary of the Valar. He offers knowledge. He helps forge the lesser Rings of Power. And then, drawing on everything he has learned working alongside the greatest living craftsman of the Noldor. He goes alone to Mount Doom and forges the One. Tolkien is precise about what happens in the moment Sauron puts on the One Ring. Celebrimbor and the other elves who bear the three feel it immediately. They sense the domination in it. They take off their own rings at once, and Sauron, furious that his deception has been discovered, demands the rings back. Celebrimbor refuses. War follows. Celebrimbor is captured and killed. Tolkien in the Silmarillion writes that Sauron used his body as a banner. That is the kind of detail that the timeline presents dry as data, but that is actually, if you stop and hear it, completely devastating. The most gifted craftsman of the Second Age, a man whose grandfather made the Silmarils, is killed and displayed as an object lesson. The three elven rings, which Celebrimbor made separately, after the deception was revealed, without Sauron's knowledge or touch, are saved. They are hidden. The white ring, Nenya, eventually comes to Galadriel. The red ring, Narya, eventually comes to Círdan, and then to Gandalf. The blue rings, Vilya and Nenya, no wait. Let me be precise about this, because the distribution matters. Vilya, the Ring of Air, goes to Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, and eventually to Elrond. Nenya, the Ring of Water, goes to Galadriel. Narya, the Ring of Fire, goes to Círdan and is given to Gandalf on his arrival in Middle-earth in the Third Age. These three rings become the backbone of everything the elves managed to preserve in the Third Age. Rivendell and Lothlorien, and the hope that is kept alive in both of those places across 3,000 years. They are powered by elvish will and elvish love and the desire to hold time still, to preserve what is beautiful against the march of decay. They cannot create, they can only preserve. And even that preservation, Tolkien makes clear in the Council of Elrond, is entirely dependent on the One Ring remaining out of Sauron's grasp. If Sauron gets the One Ring back, the three are revealed and broken, and everything they have held in place dissolves. The elves know this, and have known it since the moment they felt the One Ring's making in their own rings. They have spent the entire Third Age living on that knife edge. But we are still in the Second Age, and the shadow on Númenor is deepening. Sauron, after his wars against the elves, is eventually captured by the Númenorians themselves. Or rather, he allows himself to be captured. He goes to Númenor as a prisoner, but enters it as a plotter, and within a generation he has become the most influential counselor at the court of the king, Ar-Pharazôn, the most powerful king Númenor has ever produced. Sauron whispers to Ar-Pharazôn the thing he most wants to hear, that the Valar are liars, that mortality is not a gift but a theft, that the undying lands can be taken by force, that the greatest navy in the history of the world is capable of conquering death itself. Picture this. Ar-Pharazôn's fleet, described in the Akallabeth as the greatest armament that has ever been prepared in the history of the world. Ship after ship after ship, the entire naval power of a civilization that has spent 3,000 years mastering the sea, arrayed in formation, sailing west. The sky darkens as they go. The clouds gather. There is something in the air that any reasonable person would recognize as a warning, as the world itself signaling that this cannot work, that this is not how reality operates. And Ar-Pharazôn sails on. He lands on the shores of Aman. The Valar, faced with a human army landing on the sacred shore, do something they have never done before. They lay down their governance. They relinquish stewardship of the world and call directly on Ilúvatar, the One himself. And Ilúvatar ends Númenor. The sea opens. The fleet of Ar-Pharazôn is swallowed. The island of Númenor sinks into the ocean in a single catastrophic event. 25 centuries of Númenorian civilization, their libraries, their great harbor at Romena, their capital of Armenelos with its golden dome, the graves of every king, the fields that fed them, the forests they planted, all of it is simply gone. And then Ilúvatar does the other thing, the thing that changes the physical structure of reality. He makes the world round. He removes Valinor from the circles of the earth, translates it to a realm that is physically inaccessible by ordinary navigation. The world is no longer flat. The straight road, the old path that the elves can still sail to reach the undying lands, still exists, but it requires divine permission and an elvish ship to find it. For mortal men, it is gone. You can sail west forever, and you will never arrive. This is, as I said at the beginning of this script, a moment where the physical structure of reality is rewritten by an act of divine will. No other invented mythology attempts this and means it literally. Tolkien is not describing a historical shift in cosmological understanding, a moment where people stopped believing the world was flat. He is describing a moment where the world actually stopped being flat, because a civilization's hubris forced the divine to restructure the terms of existence. The Second Age ends shortly after Númenor's fall. The survivors, led by Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion, reach Middle-earth. They carry with them the seedling of Nimloth, the white tree of Númenor, that was itself descended from Celeborn of Tol Eressëa, that was itself descended from Galadhilion, that was itself a flower of Telperion, one of the two trees. A direct botanical lineage from the foundation of the world to a piece of bark carried on a desperate ship through a flood. Tolkien is threading something across the entire length of his timeline. There is always something small that survives, always something carried. Elendil founds Gondor and Arnor, and Sauron, who did not survive Númenor's drowning in physical form, but whose spirit survived because the One Ring survived, eventually returns in diminished form, rebuilds, and triggers the last alliance of elves and men. The last alliance. Gil-galad and Elendil together. The last time the free peoples of Middle-earth unite in open war with anything like their full strength. The siege of Barad-dûr lasts 7 years. 7 years of siege. Tolkien's appendices give you that number and move on, but sit with it for a moment. 7 years of an army living in the field before the gates of the Dark Tower, fighting off sorties, maintaining supply lines, holding together a coalition that would be strained to breaking under far less pressure. The cost is total. Gil-galad dies. Elendil dies. Anarion has already died. Of the great leaders who began the siege, only Isildur survives. And Isildur, facing Sauron himself, cuts the ring from his hand with his father's broken sword, and does not destroy it. This is the moment that the entire Third Age turns on. This is the hinge, and the tragedy of it is not that Isildur was cowardly or weak. The tragedy, the specific and particular tragedy that Tolkien builds across the entire narrative, is that Isildur was in that moment exactly the kind of person the ring was designed to subvert. He was a strong man, a proud man, a man who had lost his father and his brother on that field, a man who had saved the seedling of the White Tree from Sauron's grasp before the siege began, a man who was, in every meaningful sense, one of the genuine heroes of the Second Age, and the ring found the crack in him anyway. He calls it a weregild for his father and his brother. He claims it as his right, and he walks away. The Second Age ends. Sauron's spirit flees. But the ring is in the world. And because the ring is in the world, what follows is not victory but extension. The Third Age begins not as a new chapter, but as borrowed time. 3,021 years of the Third Age. Let that number sit for a moment. The time between the last alliance and the War of the Ring is 3,000 years. Rome did not last that long, at least not in any continuous recognizable form. 3,000 years of Sauron slowly rebuilding, of the elvish rings holding their refuges in preservation, of men forgetting, of the line of kings coming apart, of the great civilization that survived Númenor's fall, slowly losing its memory of what it was. This is what Tolkien means when he talks about the waning of the elves and the forgetting of men. It is not a mystical process. It is time. 3,000 years of not losing catastrophically but also not winning, of holding on, of slow erosion. The Palantiri, the seeing stones that Elendil's people brought from Númenor, are one by one lost or taken. The kingdom of Arnor, the northern realm, fractures into 3 lesser kingdoms and then fades entirely, leaving only the Rangers, the Dunedain, remnants of the royal line living in the wilderness, knowing who they are, biding their time without knowing they are biding it. Gondor holds in the south, but does not hold what it was. The kings become stewards. The stewards manage a reduced inheritance. Each generation slightly dimmer than the last, not through any failure of will, but through the simple mathematics of attrition across millennia. And then Sauron moves. Now here is where the timeline of the Third Age does something that almost nobody talks about. The War of the Ring is not Sauron's first attempt to re-establish dominance in the Third Age. It is his third serious campaign after his return to power. He held Dol Guldur in Mirkwood for centuries before Gandalf identified him there. He was expelled by the White Council's assault in 2941 of the Third Age, the same year as the quest of Erebor, the same year Bilbo finds the ring. But that expulsion did not destroy him. He withdrew to Mordor, which he had been preparing for exactly this eventuality, and rebuilt faster than the Council had hoped. The White Council's assault on Dol Guldur is one of the moments where the timeline reveals its own irony most clearly. The greatest collection of wisdom and power in the Third Age succeeded in exactly the wrong way at exactly the wrong moment. They pushed Sauron out of Mirkwood, into Mordor, where he was stronger. Gandalf suspected it. The Unfinished Tales section on the Astari and on the hunt for the ring make clear that Gandalf's urgency about the ring in the years following the expulsion from Dol Guldur was partly motivated by his understanding that they had not won but had merely repositioned the threat. And what does Saruman do during this period? Saruman, who has been scouting the Gladden Fields for the ring for decades, who knows that Gandalf suspects the ring has resurfaced, does the worst possible thing. He reassures the Council that the ring has rolled down the Anduin to the sea. He says this because he wants more time to find it himself. He says this knowing it may not be true. And this lie, this specific act of self-interested deception by the person most capable of coordinating a real response, delays organized action against Sauron by decades. The betrayal at the center of the Third Age is not just Isildur's. It is Saruman's, and Saruman's betrayal, unlike Isildur's, is not the betrayal of grief or weakness. It is the betrayal of someone who has decided that his own desire for the ring is worth risking the world. Here is where the timeline does something interesting that connects back to the very beginning. Remember Melkor's discord in the music? The self-aggrandizing theme that sought to drown out the harmony for the sake of its own expression? Saruman is doing the same thing. On a smaller scale, yes, but structurally identical. And this pattern of the gifted and powerful, subverting the whole for the sake of the self, is one of the deepest grooves worn into the timeline of Middle-earth. It repeats in every age. It repeats in Feanor. It repeats in Ar-Pharazôn. It repeats in Saruman. And each time it repeats, it costs slightly more than the time before. We are now deep into the Third Age, deep into the material most viewers came here for, but I want you to notice something. By the time we reach Bilbo Baggins and the Shire and the comfortable armchair world of The Hobbit, we are at year 2941 of the Third Age, which is itself the continuation of a history that began tens of thousands of years before the sun first rose. The world of The Hobbit, which feels cozy and small and safe, is built on geological strata of loss that go all the way down to the music before creation. The Shire is approximately 1,000 years old at this point. The Blue Mountains to its east, the mountains Bilbo and the dwarves pass through, are what remains of the Ered Luin, the great mountain range that formed the western boundary of Beleriand, before Beleriand sank. The mountains are the walls of a drowned land. Every time someone in the Shire looks east at those mountains, they are looking at the shore of the First Age. The quest of Erebor. Thorin Oakenshield and his company, Gandalf, and Bilbo. This is primarily a story about a dwarven king reclaiming his home from a dragon, and that is what it is on its surface. But Gandalf's motives, which Tolkien lays out in Unfinished Tales with the clarity of a general explaining strategy after the battle, are larger. Gandalf is worried about what happens if Sauron, who he knows is rebuilding, manages to ally with Smaug. A dragon of that size in alliance with the rising power of Mordor is a strategic disaster. The quest of Erebor is, among other things, a preemptive strategic operation against a threat that has not yet materialized but that Gandalf can see coming. And part of that operation, entirely unplanned, is that Bilbo finds the ring. Gandalf's role in the finding of the ring is one of the most discussed questions in Tolkien scholarship, and rightly so. He says repeatedly in the text that he does not know why Bilbo was meant to find the ring, that this is a providence beyond his calculation. But what Tolkien writes in Letter 156 is illuminating. He says that the design of the enemy is always susceptible to the counter-movement of what he calls the secret fire, the divine power that Gandalf, as a servant of the Valar, carries. Providence is real in this mythology, not as a narrative convenience, but as a cosmological fact. And the finding of the ring by a creature as small and unlikely and resistant to its influence as a hobbit is exactly the kind of counter-movement that a darkness woven into the music at creation would never anticipate. Bilbo carries the ring for 60 years. The ring that Isildur took from Sauron's hand as a weregild for his father and his brother. The ring that was lost in the Gladden fields when the orc arrow took Isildur from his horse. The ring that lay in the river mud for 2,500 years before Daegul found it and Smaugl killed him for it. The ring that Smaugl, who became Gollum, kept in his cave under the Misty Mountains for nearly 5 centuries. The ring that Bilbo found in that cave and brought home and put in a drawer and forgot about, more or less, until Gandalf came to ask uncomfortable questions. And here, right here, in the quiet domestic reality of Bag End, the full weight of the timeline lands. Because Gandalf, sitting in Bilbo's study, looking at a small gold ring on a table, is doing the arithmetic that the viewer has now done with this script. He knows about the One Ring. He has known about it in the abstract for a very long time. He knows what its finding would mean. He knows about the rings of power and their making and the war that followed. He knows about the last alliance. He knows about Isildur's choice on the slopes of Orodruin. He knows about the Gladden fields. He is, in this moment, the only person in the Third Age who can connect all of those dots and understand what is sitting on that table. The test for the ring comes later, in the Hearthfire, where the letters of fire appear in the black speech of Mordor. Ash Nazg Durbatuluk, one ring to rule them all. But the decision about what to do with the ring, the decision that will drive the entire War of the Ring, begins here, in a hobbit hole, with a wizard sitting very still in the firelight, doing math that stretches back 30,000 years. Picture this. Gandalf alone in that study after Bilbo has left. After the argument. After Bilbo surrendered the ring with more difficulty than surrendering should require. After the door closed and the night came down. Gandalf with the ring in front of him, or perhaps already in the envelope on the mantelpiece, and the full scope of what this means beginning to settle. He knows what the ring is, and what it does, and what it will do to anyone who reaches for it, including himself. He refuses to take it. He tells Frodo later that he was tempted, that he thought about what he could do with it. That is his honesty and his greatness, that he knows his own danger well enough to step back from it. But in that moment in Bag End, before the journey south, before the Council of Elrond, the world pivots on a decision made by an old wizard in a hobbit hole in the Shire, a place that did not exist 5,000 years ago, in a part of the world that was not mapped until 3,000 years after the music was sung. 60 years pass between Bilbo's finding of the ring and Frodo's departure from the Shire. In the grand span of the timeline we have been walking, 60 years is an eye blink. Sauron could not return to full power in 60 years. He needs the ring for that. But Sauron is patient in a way that is genuinely terrifying once you understand the timeline, because Sauron has watched the long arc of history the way a strategist watches a board. He has seen the last alliance. He has felt his physical form destroyed. He has rebuilt. He has done all of this before. His patience is not the patience of someone who believes he will eventually win on his current arc. It is the patience of someone who knows that time itself is on his side, because he has more of it than anyone else in the game. The War of the Ring begins, in the fullest sense, when Sauron's Nazgûl cross into the Shire looking for Baggins and the Ring. These 9 riders, the Ringwraiths, the Uleri, are themselves an artifact of the timeline we have been walking. They were once men, great kings and sorcerers of the Second Age, given rings of power by Sauron as part of the same scheme that produced the rings of the dwarves and the 3 elven rings. The 9 were given their rings in the Second Age. By the time they cross into the Shire in the Third Age, they have been wraiths for approximately 3,000 years. 3,000 years of existence as something neither living nor dead, neither in the world nor out of it. The chief of them, the Lord of the Nazgûl, the Witch King of Angmar, Tolkien identifies in the appendices as the greatest of Sauron's servants. A king so mighty in the Second Age that he is not matched in weaponscraft or sorcery by any living man in the Third Age. And here is the piece that connects back across the whole span of the timeline, in a way that should feel like the floor dropping out from under you. The Witch King of Angmar, riding in the Shire looking for a hobbit, is likely one of the kings of Númenor. Not one of the faithful, not one of Elendil's people who sailed east and founded Gondor and Arnor, one of the Shadow Kings, one of the men who were tempted by Sauron's whispers, who reached for power and immortality and received instead a particular kind of hell, the eternal servitude of the undying. The civilization whose hubris forced Ilúvatar to reshape the world, whose arrogance pulled an entire continent under the sea, produced the thing now riding through the Shire looking for a ring. The corruption that began with the shadow falling over Númenor eventually produces the 9 greatest instruments of darkness in the Third Age. That is the timeline working in full. That is what 37,000 years of documented history, of the pattern repeating and repeating, of creation and survival and ruin again, eventually produces. A wraith who was once a king, riding through a land that is one of the youngest and least historical places in Middle-earth, looking for one of the smallest and most ordinary kinds of people that world contains, because that ordinary person found a ring in a tunnel and put it in his pocket. The full scope of it is almost too large to see clearly, but that is the point. That is exactly the point. The quest from the Shire to the Council of Elrond, to the Fellowship, to the breaking of the Fellowship, to the long march of Frodo and Sam to Mordor runs across roughly a year, from late September of year 3018 to March 25th, 3019, the date on which the ring is destroyed. 1 year in a timeline that contains thousands of years of history. And the choice that determines the outcome is not made in battle. It is not made in strategy. It is made in a dark place, at the edge of a fire, by a creature named Gollum, who has spent 500 years alone with a ring that was already ancient when Isildur took it. Gollum bites off Frodo's finger. Gollum falls into the fire. The ring is destroyed, and Sauron's spirit, which was bound to the ring because Sauron had poured his will and his power and his malice into it, disperses. The eye goes out. Tolkien writes in letter 246 that Frodo, at the crack of doom, fails. He does not choose to destroy the ring. He cannot. The ring at that point is too strong, and Frodo's will, however extraordinary across the length of the journey, is not sufficient at the final moment. What destroys the ring is not heroic will. It is Gollum's obsession and Ilúvatar's providence, and the long chain of events stretching back through Bilbo's pity and Gandalf's advice to Frodo in Moria, that even the wise cannot see all ends. This is not a failure of the story. This is the story being philosophically honest about power and will and what they can and cannot do. The ring cannot be resisted indefinitely by will alone. The only solution is to not have the ring in the world at all. And the method by which that happens is not a triumph of virtue, but a convergence of mercy, accident, and something that Tolkien explicitly names as grace. The pity that Bilbo showed to Gollum in the caverns under the misty mountains, that Gandalf praised and Frodo eventually practiced, is what saves the world. Not power, pity. This is also, and I want to be precise here, this is also a statement about the timeline, about what it has taken. The mercy shown to Gollum is possible in part because of everything Gandalf understands about the long history of the ring and the people bound to it. Because Gandalf is old enough and wise enough and has read the timeline deeply enough to understand that Gollum is not simply a monster, but the ruin of a person, a hobbit-like creature named Smeagol, who was destroyed by something designed specifically to destroy. Pity is the appropriate response. And that pity, extended across decades, extended at personal cost to Frodo, who carries the ring on the last leg of the journey, while Gollum follows, is what creates the accident at the crack of doom. The timeline of Middle-earth, all 37,000 years of it, resolves in an act of mercy extended to its most pathetic figure. That is what Tolkien built. That is the argument at the center of this entire cosmology. After the ring's destruction, the Third Age ends formally. The ring-bearers sail west. The Elven rings, with the One Ring gone, lose their power. Rivendell and Lothlorien, which have held their beauty and preservation for 3,000 years, through the power of Vilya and Nenya, begin to fade. The elves who remain in Middle-earth will feel the slow dissolution of everything their rings have preserved. This is not a punishment. It is simply the working out of the cosmological rules that have governed the rings since their making. You cannot have the preservation without the power, and the power was always Sauron's power, not theirs, even though they used it for beauty and healing, rather than domination. The three were made with metal from the same lore that made the one. The light in them is borrowed light. Galadriel's choice at the Council of the Ring, when she refuses Frodo's offer of the One Ring, is the most eloquent statement of this that the text contains. She says she has long considered what she would do if the ring came to her. She says she would begin with the intent to use it for good. She says she knows exactly how that story ends. In place of the Dark Lord, you would have a queen, not dark but beautiful, and terrible as the morning and the night, fairer than the sea and the mountains, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair. That is not a fantasy. That is a self-assessment so precise and so honest that it requires having spent a very long time looking at yourself clearly. Galadriel has had the entire Second Age and the entire Third Age to understand exactly what she is capable of and what that capability would cost. She refuses the ring, not because she is not powerful enough to wield it, but because she is wise enough to understand that wielding it would cost her the thing she actually is. She passes the test. She remains herself, and she goes west. The Fourth Age begins. Ilisar is crowned. The king returns. The line of Isildur, which has been maintained for 3,000 years through generations of rangers in the wilderness, whose oldest living representative spent decades wandering Middle-earth as Strider without claiming what was his, takes the throne of Gondor. The white tree blooms again. A new sapling found on the slopes of Mindolluin by the king himself, fulfilling a tradition that goes back through the white tree of Gondor, through the tree that Isildur saved a cutting of from Númenor, through the tree before that, all the way back to the silver light of Telperion. And Tolkien does not tell us what the Fourth Age contains. He doesn't. He gives us the briefest outline in Appendix B. He gives us the departure of the ring-bearers. He gives us Aragorn and Arwen. He gives us Sam returning to the Shire and planting the party tree and the Malorn seed from Galadriel. He gives us Merry and Pippin eventually riding north and living long and being buried at Edoras and Minas Tirith respectively. and Aragorn dying, and Arwen dying alone on Seren Amroth, when she could no longer bear the world without him, and Sam sailing from the Grey Havens, the last ring-bearer, the last one left, going west across the sea. And then there is Legolas, who eventually builds a ship and sails west and takes Gimli with him, the only dwarf who has ever been allowed to make that crossing, and the reason Gimli is allowed to go is because of Galadriel, who loved him as a friend across the impossibility of their friendship, who saw in him something worth carrying across the sea. That is the timeline's last gift, an impossible friendship carried to the undying lands. The grudge between dwarves and elves that goes back to the First Age, to the murder of Thingol, to the sack of Menegroth, to the ancient grievances that Tolkien never fully resolved in the lore, partially healed in the friendship of one elf and one dwarf who refused to perform the enmity their histories prescribed. The Fourth Age leads, eventually, in the largest frame of Tolkien's mythology, to us, to the world as it is. Tolkien was always explicit about this. Middle-earth is our Earth. The mythology is a mythology for England, for the world we live in now, placed at an imagined prehistoric distance. The Fourth Age ends, and the Fifth Age comes, and the world we know begins. Which means the timeline of Middle-earth is not a fantasy history. It is, in Tolkien's understanding, the prehistory of the world we are sitting in right now. The griefs in it are not imagined griefs. The loss is not a fictional loss. It is the loss of a beauty that was real in some sense, that Tolkien believed in deeply, a beauty that left traces, that left the mountains and the sea and the stars, that left the impulse to make things and name things and love things that cannot last. And now the central question, which we asked at the beginning, and which I want to ask again, not in the same way, but with the full weight of everything we have walked through. If every age in this timeline ends in destruction, if the years of the lamps end in Melkor's violence, and the years of the trees end in Ungoliant's darkness, and the First Age ends in Belarion's drowning, and the Second Age ends in Numenor's sinking, and the Third Age ends in the dissolution of everything the elves preserved, if this is the pattern, if this is what the timeline actually is when you step back and look at the shape of it, then what exactly is the defeat of Sauron? It cannot be a final victory. Tolkien is not that kind of mythologist. The last battle, the Dagor-Dagorath, the final conflict at the end of days, is gestured at in the earliest versions of the mythology. It is never fully articulated, but the pattern of the timeline suggests it. The pattern says, there will be another age, and another darkness, and another something that survives to carry the light forward. This is not despair. This is the structure that Tolkien believes in, the structure in which the light is always preserved, always carried in something small and likely, always survives the ruin of the age that held it. The sapling of the white tree carried from Numenor, the line of the kings maintained through the wilderness. The three rings used not for conquest but for preservation, the mercy shown to Gollum that became the pivot of the world. Small things, stubborn things, things that survived not through power, but through the refusal to stop caring. This is what Tolkien built the timeline to show. He built 37,000 years of documented history and an undocumented prehistory, stretching back to the music before time, so that he could demonstrate one thing with the authority of accumulated evidence. The darkness is real and deep, and has been there from before the first moment, and cannot be permanently defeated. And the light is also real, and it persists, and it is carried forward by the most unlikely hands. And that is enough. That has to be enough. Because that is what the whole of the timeline, every age of it, every ruin and survival and carrying forward, that is what it actually says. The grief is structural, and so is the love. Tolkien wrote in Letter 64, in a context of personal grief and wartime loss, that his mythology was an attempt to realize on paper a largely linguistic aesthetic invention, but that it had grown into something else, something that was primarily linguistic in inspiration, and was begun in order to provide the necessary background of history for elvish tongues. And then, underneath that scholarly justification, there is the thing he actually meant. He built this world because he believed in the consolation of the sub-creator. He believed that making beautiful things, even things that could be lost, was a moral act. That the elvish impulse to preserve, to hold against time what time would otherwise take, was not delusion but courage. That the act of loving something you know you will lose is not sentimental weakness. It is the most precise and honest response to the actual condition of existence. The elves knew from the beginning that they would outlive Middle-earth. They knew that the world would eventually wear down to its end, and they would have watched every beautiful thing they ever loved be taken. They loved those things anyway. They made songs about them. They built cities that they knew would fall. They planted trees in gardens they would have to leave. And when the time came, they sailed west, carrying their grief and their memory with them, carrying the love that grief requires, across the sea, to a place beyond the circles of the world. Galadriel once had a light in a phial, the light of Arundel's star, which is the light of a Silmaril, which is the light of the two trees, which is the light that was in the world before Morgoth darkened it, before the lamps fell, before the music became time. She gave that phial to Frodo for the darkest parts of the journey, the light of the oldest thing in the world, carried by the smallest person in it, into the deepest shadow. That is the timeline of Middle-earth in a single image. So I want to leave you with the question in its final and heaviest form. Not, was the defeat of Sauron a true ending? Because we both know by now that the answer is no, not in the sense of final permanence, not in the sense of the darkness being gone. The real question, the one that Tolkien spent his entire writing life building toward without ever fully answering, is this: if the beautiful things are always lost, and the light is always carried forward in something small and impermanent, and the pattern repeats across ages beyond counting, what is the meaning of choosing to love the beautiful things anyway? What does it mean to fight for something you know cannot be kept? What does it mean to be Galadriel, sailing west with 3,000 years of loss and a love for Middle-earth that will not stop aching? Or to be Sam, returning to the Shire after everything he has seen, planting a tree in the garden and watching it grow, knowing that even this will eventually end? Tolkien's answer, buried in the architecture of the timeline, is not that the love is meaningless because the things are lost. His answer is that the love is the point, that the grief is the measure of what mattered. That the willingness to care, to plant the tree, to carry the light, to show mercy to the creature that cannot be helped, to give the phial and trust in small hands, is not a flaw in the face of the darkness. It is the only thing, across 37,000 years of history, that the darkness has never been able to make. If any part of this lit something up for you, if you have your own sense of what the Fourth Age holds, or what the Dagor-Dagorath means for the pattern we have walked tonight, or if there is a corner of this timeline you think deserves more light than it gets, come into the comments. I mean that. The best part of this is not the monologue. It is the conversation that comes after. The legendarium is large enough that no one person sees all of it, and every fresh set of eyes brings something I missed. That is the point of the sub-creative tradition that Tolkien built, and that we are still building in his wake. If this is the kind of journey you want to keep taking, subscribe and come back. There is more of this world than any one video can hold. There always has been.